have great pleasure, therefore, in reading you the opening paper on parapsychology and the Transfiguration. A week or so after Peter had first publicly voiced his conviction that Jesus was the Messiah, we are told that Jesus took Peter and the brothers James and John up a high mountain to pray. Whilst he was there, his face began to shine like the sun, and his clothes became white and dazzling. Two figures appeared in the glory and talked with him. As they were departing, Peter called out with a suggestion that he should make 3 tents for the 3 of them. As he spoke, a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice called out of the cloud, "This is my Son," whereat Jesus was on his own once more, and the vision had faded. If this were a New Testament Congress rather than a conference on Christian parapsychology, I would have to spend a great deal of my time in deducing what points the 3 gospel writers wanted to make by the different ways in which they treated the tradition which had come down to them. Our New Testaments give us 3 accounts of the incident, in Mark 9, Matthew 17 and Luke 9, and there is one explicit reference to it, ostensibly from an eyewitness, in the 2nd epistle of Peter, though most New Testament scholars put this as probably the latest piece of writing in the whole New Testament, and a long way away from the historical Peter. Why is it that only Luke tells us the subject of the conversation between Jesus and the 2 men? Why is it that only Matthew mentions that Jesus told the disciples not to be afraid? Why does Mark reverse the usual order and talk about Elijah with Moses, whereas the others who normally copy him say Moses and Elijah? These may sound footling points, but they are of the stuff of detective investigation, and by asking them, the New Testament specialist can strip later accretions off an original story and reveal the way in which it was first told. Questions like this are important because we want to know whether we're dealing with an accurate historical record of things as they actually happened, or whether what we have is a doctored account which is of more interest to the historian of doctrine than it is to the person who is looking for an explanation of a puzzling piece of the paranormal. My neighbour, Professor Stephen Sykes, in his book The Identity of Christianity, has recently reminded us that it's no good trying to do theology without taking into account the researches of the New Testament specialists. We can't simply assume that a cursory glance at the texts is all the necessary background we need. We have to know how those texts are treated by those who make it their lifetime specialization to do so. Indeed, as he says, unless theologians know a certain amount, not merely about the New Testament, but about every relevant theological discipline, they will be unable to do their job properly. That's a terrifying requirement. But at the beginning of an international conference of Christian parapsychologists, it needs to be said. We will not gain any respect for our study if all we are is a bunch of bumbling amateurs. We must engage with those who know what they're talking about in other branches of study. And parapsychology is like theology. There's hardly a branch of study that it doesn't impinge on somewhere or other. Well, having said that, the only decent thing to do would be to sit down and shut up before I reveal my own ignorance. I won't do that, partly because it would leave an awkward gap in the program, but mainly because I'm sure that parapsychologists have got something to say to New Testament specialists when they're examining the Transfiguration narrative. And if the New Testament specialists can take it on board, it will help theologians towards a more complete understanding of the episode as a whole. First, though, let alone the details, are we sure that the Transfiguration happened at all? There have been New Testament scholars who have held that it was pure invention on the part of the first moulders of the tradition, and that by the time the Gospel writers came upon the scene, it was too late to recognize what had happened. At some early stage in the tradition, they claim, a story about an appearance of the resurrected Jesus had become transferred into an account of something that happened during his incarnate life. Look where the Transfiguration comes in the Gospel. It is immediately after Jesus' first prediction of his passion and resurrection, and in Luke it is explicitly linked with the exodus which Jesus is about to accomplish in Jerusalem. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus says that the story of the Transfiguration shouldn't be told to anyone until the Son of Man shall have risen again from the dead. That shows that the story was unknown until after the resurrection, and that it was linked with it. It must be a misplaced resurrection story, placed at this point to explain the relation of glory to suffering, a theme treated in other ways by the Gospel of John, who has no Transfiguration story, but for whom glory and suffering are intimately linked. Few New Testament scholars now hold this view. None of the other resurrection appearances speak of the glory or the luminosity of Jesus. We have to wait until the appearance to Stephen at his martyrdom or to Saul on the Damascus road for this motif. All the other resurrection appearances are of a Jesus who looks like an ordinary human being, and they take the form of a missionary-based call to witness and action. The motif and genre of the Transfiguration story is entirely different. As C.H. Dodd wrote long ago, if the theory of a displaced post-resurrection appearance is to be evoked, it must be in the teeth of the presumption which formal analysis establishes. So I think we may leave on one side the theory that there never was a transfiguration. But did it happen as we are told? J.A. McGuckin has an article in the Clergy Review for August 1984 in which he argues otherwise. And I am grateful to Leslie Price, who doesn't miss much, for drawing my attention to this. McGuckin carries out a great deal of the kind of detective work on the details of the three accounts and the differences between them to which I referred at the beginning of this paper. If you want to follow that kind of thing, you'll have to go to his original. But his conclusions are that Moses and Elijah didn't appear in the primitive form of the story, and that Peter is a great deal more significant than James or John. The original story, he says, is about the appearance of two angels to Jesus. You'll remember that in the resurrection story, Luke describes what we think of as the angels at the tomb as two men in dazzling apparel. And in his account of the Transfiguration, Luke writes, "And behold, there talked with him two men who appeared in glory and spake with him." There is also a mention of Moses and Elijah, but apart from that, the descriptions of the Transfiguration and of the resurrection are remarkably alike. McGuckin sees the Transfiguration as a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy. When Moses went up the holy mountain to receive the law from God, he returned with the skin of his face shining. So Jesus goes up a holy mountain to commune with his heavenly Father, and the glory visibly lights him up. In the Old Testament story, the authority of Moses was shared with Aaron. In the New Testament one, the authority of Jesus passes to Peter. The reference in 2 Peter enshrines the same primitive tradition in which it is Peter's link with the Transfiguration which gives him his apostolic authority. So an early story in which Jesus meets with angels and which contains echoes of a story about Moses has turned into an account of an appearance of Moses. My own opinion is that too great a superstructure of speculation is being raised on foundations that are too flimsy to support it. Moses and Elijah appear inextricably, in Peter's words, in all 3 synoptics. To expunge them from the account on the grounds that Luke's first mention of them is in parentheses seems to me to be a little draconian. So why not take the accounts broadly as they stand and ask the parapsychological question: what lies behind them? That question is a question about the nature of the underlying data rather than about their interpretation, but we'll soon find that data and interpretation are very difficult to keep apart. I have tried to be a philosopher, said Oliver Edwards to Dr. Johnson, but cheerfulness keeps breaking in. I try to be a parapsychologist, but theology will do the same. There are 2 aspects to the Transfiguration story which I would like to fasten upon. The first is the appearing of Moses and Elijah, and the second is the light or luminosity. What are we to make of the appearing of Moses and Elijah? Exegetes point out that they can be regarded as symbolic figures, Moses standing for the law and Elijah for the prophets. Jesus holds converse with the law and the prophets, the religious tradition of his countrymen, but in the end it is they who fade away and Jesus alone who is left. Whatever truth there may be in this interpretation, it doesn't necessarily entail that because the figures had a symbolic importance, they were not present in reality. It's interesting that the figures who appear are Moses and Elijah, not Adam and Noah, not Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. In other words, they were figures from what we now recognize as the real history of Israel, not mythical characters from the mists of a prehistoric folk tradition. Could Moses and Elijah have been present on the Mount of the Transfiguration? If so, how, and what would their presence signify? There was a tradition that Elijah would return before the day of the Lord, and some people had been speculating that John the Baptist was fulfilling this role. According to St. Matthew, this was the case. According to Luke, John the Baptist is only a prophet who acts in the spirit and power of Elijah, and according to the 4th Gospel, John explicitly denies that he was Elijah. There was another wave of speculation which linked Jesus himself with the promised return of Elijah, and that appears in all 3 Gospels. It's probable that ideas of reincarnation were being canvassed, and that the Pharisees at one stage toyed with this doctrine. Whilst the Transfiguration occurred after the death of John the Baptist, so that I suppose it would have been possible for Elijah to have been reincarnated as John and then to reappear in his original person by the time of the Transfiguration, it hardly seems possible to say that Jesus was a reincarnation of Elijah, else who was appearing with whom at the Transfiguration. Except that it may be a mistake to be too precise, After all, some people were saying that Jesus was John the Baptist come to life again, and Jesus and John had been contemporaries. My own opinion is that both Jesus and John shared something of the spirit and power of Elijah, so that they could be spoken of as Elijahs, rather in the same vein as Shylock praises Portia as a Daniel come to judgment. The Transfiguration closes off one option in the debate about reincarnation. Elijah is still Elijah, and he has not been transformed into anyone else. How could Elijah and Moses have been present on the Mount? Christian parapsychologists of an earlier generation may have been tempted to use Maurice Eliot's phrase in ectoplasmic form, which he uses in his book The Bible as Psychic History, which came out about 25 years ago. Fewer parapsychologists today hold a brief for the materialization medium, and Jesus doesn't seem to have had anything in common with such phenomena. If that were to be the explanation of the Transfiguration, it would be an entirely one-off occurrence within the New Testament, with nothing leading up to it, and nothing comparable following on from it. Frankly, it is incredible. The word which Mark and Matthew use about Moses and Elijah is instructive. It is ophthei, there appeared. The aorist indicative passive of oro, I discern or perceive. This is not a word which is used in the passive in the New Testament of ordinary seeing, but one which comes within the stories of the resurrection. It's a word which is used of someone who is seen, but not by normal sight, someone who allows himself to be seen. It's a word which is more redolent of the seeing by the inner eye, the seeing of revelation, than of what would show up on a camera pointed in the right direction. And this impression which we get from the word ophthei is confirmed when we ask about the mental state of the three witnesses. And here it's Luke who gives us the clue. Now Peter and they that were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men that stood with him. Our first reaction is to think of hypnopompic imagery, and our second is to reflect that Peter, for one, was no stranger to trance visions, as the account in Acts 10 reminds us. It seems fairly likely that this sleep of the disciples on Mount Tabor was no common sleep, but an altered state of consciousness which may well have been psi-conducive. It's probably not productive to speculate further as to whether Moses and Elijah were present quasi-physically or purely telepathically. But our knowledge of the paranormal makes it quite possible and sensible to aver that Moses and Elijah were, in some real sense, present and conversing with Jesus on the mountain of the Transfiguration. It would take us too far afield to ask what we meant by the word real in that phrase, in some real sense, though it would be a profitable exercise in the philosophy of parapsychology. Let us, however, leave Moses and Elijah and speak of the other aspect of the account, the one which has given it its title. The word which comes most readily to our minds in this respect is the word glory. In fact, that word only appears in Luke's account in those verses where he adds to the basic Markan story. What all three synoptics emphasize is that Jesus was metamorphosed, whatever that means. The word is a transliteration of the Greek, usually translated transfigured. Luke doesn't use the actual word metamorphosed, but says instead that the fashion of his countenance was altered. His face shone as the sun, adds Matthew. And all three tell us that his clothes became white as the light, glistering, dazzling, whiter than any earthly bleacher could make them. At the close of the experience, a cloud overshadowed them, and there came a voice out of the cloud. To us, a cloud speaks of mist. To the ancients, it spoke not of mist, but of mystery. Since the days of Moses, a cloud had symbolized the presence of God and of things too sacred to be seen by human eyes. So the Transfiguration was a paradox. It held within it the tension between what was as plain and shining as the face of the sun and what was as mysterious and hidden as the being of the Godhead. The blazing sun and the swirling cloud, each a symbol for something of archetypal significance. We are in the presence here not of literal description, but of something of which only hints can be given. Like the numinous which cannot be described but only evoked, we need to be sensitive not merely to what is said, but to what we can overhear. The account sets harmonics vibrating. And until we know a great deal about the cultural background of the story, we shall miss what is most significant about it, because our harmonics are not necessarily the same as those of the men of the New Testament. 20th century parapsychologists are familiar with talk about the human aura. Sensitives claim to be able to see it on frequent occasions. And if the findings of Kirlian photography can be authenticated, it may even be something detectable by physical instrumentation. The most helpful analysis of the concept of aura that I know remains the article by Dr. Charles Tart in the Journal of the SPR for March 1972. He distinguishes 4 possible kinds of aura. There is first the physical aura, in the sense that the air immediately surrounding a living body is different from the air at a distance. We perspire, and we are normally warmer than our surroundings. Our bodies may be electrically charged, and our brains are in a continuous state of electrical activity. For these reasons, there are thermal and hygroscopic gradients, air currents, and electrical and magnetic fields in the vicinity of the human body. None of this is normally visible to the naked eye, but who knows whether it may not be perceived by a suitably sensitive person and interpreted as something physically observable, like a coloured luminosity around the person's body. The second aura is the psychological aura, which is a mental or psychological concept, more often termed personal space. We act as though we are surrounded by a space, and if some other person comes uninvited into it, we feel uncomfortable and hemmed in. There is a little evidence that some people in some altered states of consciousness may be able to detect this personal space in a visual mode. Was this what happened to Moses when he came down from the holy mountain? The Israelites may have seen his personal space as a luminous cloud around him, and realized that when he came down from the mountain in a state of religious rapture, he didn't want folk to crowd in upon him. The third aura is the projected aura, which is a kind of personalized information display system whereby the observer picks up clues of various kinds about the person he's meeting and projects them in terms of a visual image surrounding that person. And fourthly and finally, there is the psychical aura, which is what psychics are usually talking about when they speak of seeing a person's aura or carrying out an aura reading. We don't have to believe in the objective existence of all four of these kinds of aura in order to have some kind of inkling as to what might have been happening to the disciples on Mount Tabor. They were in an altered state of consciousness. They were receiving communications from the father figures of the religion of their nation, and they were looking at a leader whom they had only recently openly acknowledged as the long-awaited anointed one from God. All these realizations flooded in upon them. Small wonder that they expressed the ineffable in terms which made sense within their religious culture. There was no other way. As far as they were concerned, what they saw was luminosity, dazzling whiteness, swirling clouds, and voices from heaven. We cannot expect to disentangle what we, in our superior 20th century scientific passion for objectivity, like to call basic experience, and what we like to call culturally conditioned interpretation. The experience and the interpretation together constitute a gestalt which is not further analyzable. And indeed, we in the 20th century are in no better case than our predecessors. What we experience is dictated to us by what we expect to happen or what it is possible for us to conceive. What cannot be fitted into our understanding of the world simply cannot be experienced. If we do experience something alien to us, we immediately reinterpret and tailor our experience to accord. If there were to be a time warp, and one of our medieval ancestors were to be catapulted into 20th century Heathrow or 20th century Piccadilly, he wouldn't see aeroplanes or advertising displays. He would see dragons and auras of glory. We only see what we see because from infancy we've been conditioned so to interpret the visual signals which assault our eyes. To one to whom they're meaningless, they're like the images bombarding the retina of a newborn child. So the realization, the interpretation of the Transfiguration was observed in a way which made visual sense to those in whose culture it happened. Dazzling clothes, changed faces, glows of glory, overshadowing clouds, a voice from heaven. Similar phenomena have been observed in subsequent centuries because light is a universal archetype and enlightenment is so obviously symbolized and shown forth in visual terms. So time would fail me to tell of the wealth of experience which lies behind the halos so frequently shown around the figures of the saints in Christian hagiography. As Prospero Lambertini said in the 18th century in his instructions for determining the true sanctity of candidates for canonization, there are natural flames which at times visibly encircle the human head. Luminous phenomena have continued right down to our own century. Kevin and Sue McClure, in their pamphlet Stars and Rumours of Stars, chronicle a number of occasions during the Welsh revival of the early years of this century when the same thing happened. On the road to Caesarea Philippi, then, Peter expressed in verbal and intellectual form his realization of who Jesus was. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. A week later, at the Transfiguration, that realization was transferred from the intellectual and verbal level to the whole person. It happened during an altered state of consciousness, which was probably psi-conducive, so that its truth could be authenticated and corroborated to the disciples by two great characters from the founding stage of their nation and religion. The experience was, as we say today, a right hemisphere experience. And so it came in visual rather than in verbal form as an awareness of luminous glory. The accounts have to translate it into words and therefore have to use left hemisphere terms. And we are in danger if we take those terms too literally. Words are inadequate. We do the best we can by saying with St. John that the disciples beheld the divine glory of the incarnate Christ, glory as of the only begotten of a Father, full of grace and truth. There is a similar glory in store for us Christians. We have a hope of glory in that Jesus Christ will fashion anew the body of our present humiliation, that it may be conformed to the body of his glory. Philippians 3. We shall reflect that glory like a mirror and be transformed into the same image from glory to glory. 2 Corinthians 3. The writer of the first letter of John believed that when our destiny had been disclosed, we should be like him because we shall see him as he is. And the context shows that the him whom we shall be like is God the Father, not the incarnate Jesus. So the possibility of our one day revealing a great weight of glory is in the mind of more than one New Testament writer. It is a hope of glory to come, but every so often there are occasions when that coming glory is prefigured. The Eastern Orthodox churches know more about it than the churches of the West, and Leslie Price quotes Bishop Callistos Ware, writing about one of the Desert Fathers, and quoted in the Journal of Religion and Psychical Research for April 1984, the old man stood up and opened his hands to the heaven, and his fingers became as 10 torches of fire. And he said, if you wish, you can become entirely as fire. The Transfiguration, then, speaks not only of the nature of Jesus, but of the destiny of his followers. In it we see, to use T.S. Eliot's words, a wink of heaven, and feel a tremor of bliss, which we want no longer to be denied. This is of the stuff of the numinous. Different cultures will clothe it in different guises, but the experience itself is human and elemental. At the Transfiguration, the numinous moment swept over the disciples, and Jesus was never the same for them again. If the same numinous moment has overshadowed us and been interpreted in a Christian context, that is what we too will want to say. We can read the Transfiguration account as a straightforward happening, such as a camera would have captured. We can read it as a parapsychological event, be it an aura or a materialization, and take it equally literally. Or we can take it as a mystical experience in which the depths and heights of religious understanding are plumbed and scaled, and in which the imagery by which it is described is of secondary importance. A left hemisphere attempt to describe a right hemisphere experience. As with so much of the gospel material, the narrative can be read on more than one level of significance. The meaning we find in the account will largely depend on our overall attitude to the gospel story and the response it has elicited from the deepest level of our own soul.